So I guess some of you have issues with how things are going in Iraq. Is that what this crowd, this sort of virtually unprecedented crowd is about, or is it about this extraordinary film that you're about to see? I'm Samantha Power, professor of practice here at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, and it's a huge honor to introduce Charles Ferguson to you, which I'll do in just a second, but also to inform you that we're blessed to have not only Charles to join us in the after-film discussion, but also Gerald Burke, who is standing over there in the purple, maroonish, crimson shirt. It's not a Harvard shirt. It's a Baghdad police shirt. Gerald Burke is here with us at the Kennedy School, and he was one of 6 law enforcement specialists selected by the Department of Justice to travel to Baghdad just after the war to do an assessment of the Iraqi criminal justice system. That then evolved into him becoming Baghdad police chief, or advisor rather, to Baghdad police chief in June of 2004. And he then returned to Iraq again in 2005 and became national security advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of the Interior and returned from Iraq in February 2006. He's a veteran of the U.S. Army and was on active duty from 1968 to 1970 and was an active law enforcement officer in this country for 25 years. So that's going to be a great perspective to have. He features very briefly in the film, and it'll be terrific for him to be able to field your questions afterwards, which we'll do. The film runs an hour and 40 minutes, so I hope most of you will be curious enough about Charles Ferguson's journey and relationship to the people within the film and to the topic that you'll stick around, but we'll give those of you who have to rush home time to leave in the aftermath. Charles Ferguson, I guess one way to characterize him is maybe an unlikely person to be sitting in this chair this evening. I first heard from Charles. I appear briefly in the film, unfortunately for you. But I first heard from him when he started leaving messages, very staticky voicemails on my machine here at the Kennedy School, saying he wanted to make an Iraq documentary. This was, I don't know how long, maybe 3 years ago. And indefatigable is a word that I would use to describe Charles on the basis of the string of voicemails. But as one who gets a lot of calls from high school students and others who are making their own documentaries and who tries to budget my time, I tried to ask around to hear, had anybody heard of this guy, Charles Ferguson, and this film, and nobody had. And so I was a little skeptical, and it was always very staticky, and he would get cut off in the middle of a phone and then have to call back and apologize. And it didn't sound like exactly Steven Spielberg looking for my insights. Anyway, I subsequently learned upon talking to Charles and his team that actually this was, in fact, a labor of love and a labor of conviction for Charles. He had been a businessman. He's a PhD in political science from MIT and has been a visiting scholar, and was the CEO of a company named Vermeer Technologies, who are the developers of Front Page. So he'd done well for himself, and instead of doing well and running off to the Caribbean, he decided that he was going to take his own resources and throw them into this incredible exercise, which is a journey into understanding the answer to the question that many of us as citizens have had, which is, how exactly did this happen? And what you'll see in the film that is so gratifying is Charles, in a sense, being us, being you, asking the questions you would ask if you were in the room with the policymakers who made the decisions or who didn't make the decisions or made the decisions not to decide. He's the person asking those questions, and you will hear him reacting, I think, in the way that many of you or I would react. And I was joking with him before we came down that one of my favorite moments in the film is when I think it's with Richard Armitage, they're discussing maybe the disbanding of the army or something, and you just hear Charles sort of takes in what he hears, and then you just hear his voice from the ether saying, "Really?" And that is what so many are asking, and so many obviously are suffering today, both in the U.S. Armed Forces and in the Iraqis themselves. It's a great pleasure to introduce Charles. This is not the film of a first-time filmmaker, and it just shows you how committed he was, because he made a film of first-class quality, which is what it had to be in order to distinguish itself amid all of the other Iraq films that have come out. And this is the film people are talking about, and this is the film all of you have come to see. So Charles, thank you for learning how to become a filmmaker and for answering our questions for us. Charles Ferguson.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for coming to see this not lighthearted film. You know, this is not a light comedy, as I'm sure you're very aware, and I'm gratified that you chose to spend your evening this way. I don't want to say much now. I think the film, for the most part, speaks for itself. I will just say two things. The first is that I did have a substantial background that I hope was relevant in policy analysis long ago. My PhD thesis advisor down the river was Carl Kazin, who was Deputy National Security Advisor of President Kennedy. And in many regards, I hope that this film reflects my having learned something from him. And I certainly tried. And I think that Carl did teach me to at least try to think in a very rigorous way about important things, and to endeavor to the greatest extent possible to put aside one's emotional predispositions in considering something that is truly important. And the second thing, that is the second thing that I'd like to say about the film, which is that I tried very hard to make a film which is about politics and policy, but which is not itself political. Most of the people in the film are Republicans. Most of the people in the film were involved in the administration of the occupation or decisions about the occupation in some way. Some of them were in favor of the war, some of them were not. I think in some cases it will be difficult for you to distinguish between those who ex ante were in favor of the war as opposed to those who were against the war, and I think that's a good thing. I tried to make the film in such a way that it would be accessible to and convincing to people of a wide variety of points of view, regardless of their partisan, political, ideological affiliation. You can judge whether I succeeded. It's an extraordinary story, and unless you know a lot about Iraq and what's happened there in the last 4 years, I think some of the things you're going to see, you're going to find quite surprising. Not in a good way, for the most part. So thank you for coming, and afterwards, we, Jerry Burke and Samantha Power and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
The plan was essentially, we'll stay for 3 or 4 months. We will install a government made up of exiles and led by Ahmed Chalabi. And then in August or September of 2003, we will begin a drastic reduction of troops.
Larry DeRita addressed us in one forum and said by the end of August of 2003, we will have all but 25 to 30,000 troops out of Iraq. I heard him say that in a room full of people. And I turned to my colleagues and I said, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. It's physically impossible.
The State Department's Future of Iraq project, a 13-volume study on post-war Iraq, was ignored by the Pentagon.
There was an awful lot of thinking at State Department. There are board feet of volumes on how we should do this. And almost none of this was integrated into the Pentagon's thinking.
Secretary's frustration, along with my own, grew as we watched our careful planning, our detailed planning, essentially discarded, and the people who've been involved in it essentially discarded, so that more loyal, in line with the Republican Party's views and so forth, people could be appointed to key positions in Iraq.
There is a large number of former Iraqi soldiers that are unemployed now. That is a huge concern, not only from a security standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. They're not earning an income right now.
And there's the announcement that the Iraqi army has been disbanded. And I was floored. And at this particular point in time, Walt Slocum and his team still were not in Iraq.
Colonel Hughes was the person who was in charge of dealing with the Iraqi army because none of the people from your advisory group had yet showed up in Iraq, including you. Didn't you think that maybe you should speak with him about this?
Oh, I talked with him a lot.
That's funny. He says that the order disbanding the army came as a complete surprise to him and that he learned of it by watching it on television in an airport.
Well, if that's so, that's surprising to me, but it's possible.
Well,
I talked to him. We worked together on a daily basis during the time I was there.
He came on the 16th of May,
16th of May.
For a 4-day whirlwind tour of the country.
Oh,
And then he left, and he didn't come back until the middle of June.
really?
Correct. He didn't tell you that?
This idea to disband the entire army was one that came as quite a surprise to me.
I see. What was your reaction when you learned of it?
I thought we had just created a problem. We had a lot of out-of-work soldiers. The president had already made a different decision, which was to keep battalion and below in force.
Earlier, yes.
Yeah.
But
Well, within, a couple of days' proximity. I think most of us were caught relatively unawares or completely unawares by this disbanding of the army. Secretary Powell found out about it, as I did.
which was how?
Just as we found out one day, Jerry announced that he disbanded the army.
And you had huge ammunition dumps that weren't guarded until several weeks, if not a couple months, after major combat actions ended.
I'm standing there watching these insurgents pull out rockets and mortars and bombs from these weapons caches that the Iraqis had stashed everywhere. And you go to the British or to the US, whoever's there, with your little GPS receiver and say, hey guys, we found like 18,000 million tons of bombs, and there are a bunch of Iraqis there with AK-47s taking it away. Probably not the best idea. Here's where it's located. And they say to you, we just don't have enough people to cover it. And I couldn't believe it. It wasn't the right answer. Go there and take care of it for your security, for the civilian security, for everybody. It's just a bad idea.
The CIA laid out several scenarios. It said life could be lousy, life could be okay, life could be better.
The president hadn't read it, not even the one-page summary over which we worked so hard to reduce these findings to a single readable page.
The president had not read even the executive summary.
Correct.
And they were just guessing as to what the conditions might be like.
What's your estimate of the number of people in Iraq who have been active at some level in the insurgency?
Active in some level, if you say supporting, providing safe haven to potentially, well over 100,000 people.
We have so many kinds of militia. You have the Mahdi militia, you have the Badr militia, you have many militias in this country. And they all are very democratic in arresting people and killing them.
Security is terrible in many neighborhoods where the ever-present threat of car bombs and IEDs.
انفجرت سيارة مفخخة عني. أنا هنا ووالدي هنا وأخوي هنا وأخوي انقتل بيها. أخوي استشهد بيها. وأصدقائي البسوا كلهم انقتلوا.
سكنوا في المفخخات بالعبوات المسلحين أشكال يعني تعددت أساليب الموت يعني.
Kidnappings especially. Sheer money-making gangster stuff.
Kidnapping of a small boy right in front of the hotel. a car just stopped, grabbed the boy, and drove off.
Parents will get a ransom note and they'll somehow have to raise this amount of money in a week.
It's not where you just have 1 or 2 or 3 kidnappings, but you have hundreds, and you get overwhelmed. Just has a deluge of individuals who are asking for help or soon don't ask for help anymore.
Why report it to the police? 1, we don't trust them. 2, they may be committing some of the crime.
The uniforms that they use just proliferated all over the place. So you really have lots of rogue elements and people that are using or working under the guise of the security services.
Now you can see people arrested by many sources. We don't know who are they.
Fake checkpoints in the streets stop people passing and look into their IDs and see if they were Shiites, Sunnis, Kurds, Arabs, and then either kidnap them or kill them in the same place.
When I say goodbye to my husband, I think I'm not coming back.
I mean, when you have massive civil war, violent, nasty civil war on top of 20% of the world's oil supply, that will probably engulf other regional players, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, maybe even Egypt.
If Iraq disintegrates and becomes an arena of civil war, much of it will become like little Afghanistan. It's where terrorists all over the world will find refuge.
If Iraq goes back to some sort of Islamo-fascist regime like we had under the Taliban in Afghanistan, then we're back to September the 10th, 2001, except at much larger scale and, with billions of dollars in oil money in their disposal.
We will bring to the Iraqi people food and medicines and supplies and freedom.
When we were first starting the reconstruction, there were 500 ways to do it wrong and 2 or 3 ways to do it right. What we didn't understand is that we were going to go through all 500.
I was chairman of the National Intelligence Council.
I was the director of strategic policy.
Rumsfeld called me and handled humanitarian affairs, reconstruction.
I had been to Iraq 8 times. I knew what the facts on the ground were.
I had no personnel. We had no phones for a while.
I don't think we can do this.
The president had already made a different decision.
There are volumes on how we should do this. And almost none of this was integrated into the Pentagon's thinking.
We watched our careful planning essentially discarded.
There wasn't enough time, but maybe for the next war.
The Americans were not acting as the police. They didn't know the streets of Baghdad. They didn't speak the language. It was a free-for-all.
There was absolute lawlessness.
We're in a transition period.
Stuff happens.
The Iraqi army was essentially standing there, waiting.
The Iraqi army has been disbanded, and I was floored.
You had huge ammunition dumps that weren't guarded.
I'm standing there watching these insurgents pull out rockets and mortars and bombs, and the U.S. say to you, we just don't have enough people to cover it.
We never had a single armored Humvee while we were in Iraq.
Why don't we have those resources?
You go to war with the army you have.
We don't have enough troops.
They'll be back there for their 5th, 6th, and 7th tours of duty.
Last contract I ever signed with the government.
We produced the first national estimate on the state of the insurgency. The president called it guesswork. The president hadn't read it.
Life could be lousy, life could be okay, life could be better.
If democracy cannot provide for the Iraqi people, people will say, to hell with democracy, we need strong men.
There are nights when I don't sleep very well.
I just can't hold my peace any longer.
Thank you all. So many of you have stayed and obviously want to hear from Charles and Jerry. just a couple notes. Bill White, the director of the forum, informed me as we were coming in that Seth Moulton, the Marine in the film, is so very powerful, is currently enrolled as a joint degree student between the business school. Some of you may know this, between the business school and the Kennedy School. And he was supposed to be at the Kennedy School this year, but he actually deferred in order to go back to Iraq. So that's where Seth is today while we are here. And the other thing I'm supposed to announce is that President Bush's Iraq speech will be on here starting at 9 o'clock in the forum for those of you who want to stay and watch that. Let me start just actually, Jerry, by bringing you into this conversation. I'm sure many of you have questions for both of them and probably especially for Charles. But let me say about Jerry, I probably should have said this in his introduction, but one of the people that we met in the anteroom before coming out here was the person who had been Jerry's translator in Iraq, a young 30-year-old woman named Asma Abdi. And as some of you may know, one of the many, many catastrophes, actually one of the few things that Charles, I don't think, did touch upon in the film, if I'm not mistaken, one of the few things that he did not touch, one of the few things anyway, one of the things he did that didn't come up in the film is the plight of those who actually worked with Americans in Iraq. There are 7,000 slots created for Iraqi refugees in this country this year. As of mid-August, 190 of those 7,000 slots had been filled. The total of Iraqis who've come in to the United States since the war in Iraq began is under 1,000. And when you contrast that with the million that have been taken by Syria, the million that have been taken, 1.5 million I think have been taken by Jordan and Lebanon together, it just gives you a sense of the degree to which the United States has also shirked the responsibility of dealing with the humanitarian consequences of the political and operational decisions and non-decisions that Charles documents. But back to Jerry, he managed to get his translator out of Iraq and to the United States, and I believe she's here tonight. Asma, or is she still here? Stand up, Asma, and everybody give it. It must have been very, very painful for you to watch the behind-the-scenes decision-making of a superpower at work. Jerry, what was it like? I know that tonight wasn't the first time you've seen the film, and you were interviewed by Charles. If we could just start by if you can go back to that night and tell us what it was like. You were in Iraq and dealing with the consequences of this back and forth and the policy decisions. Would you have ever guessed it was this unsophisticated?
First, a point of clarity, she did all the work herself. She managed to get through the bureaucracy of the United States government, get her application into Amman, Jordan, and then twice having to fly to Amman, Jordan. She did all the work herself, and I give her tremendous credit for that. But by way of background, I'm a career law enforcement officer. I retired from the Mass State Police as a major. I spent about 8 years out at Babson College running a management school for police supervisors. And after about 8 years, I was getting a little bit tired of the academic life out there. If you've ever been out to Babson, it's a nice, quiet campus, and if you know what police work is like, they're like two opposites. And the opportunity came to go out on an assessment, the assessment team run by the Department of Justice. We wound up going into Baghdad relatively early, about a month after the statue fell. And we lived outside the green zone. We lived in East Baghdad, and we could see the green zone. We could see the mortars land there occasionally, but we weren't in the green zone. We were actually running the streets of Baghdad. My job was to work with the police chief and the various station commanders around the city. And it's a big city. There's 57 police stations and probably another couple of dozen police facilities like a crime lab and other buildings like that, the police academy. And in some ways, we were really at the tip of the spear on the civilian side. I was driving myself around Baghdad for a while before I got an interpreter, and it wasn't until the UN building got blown up in August that the police chief assigned me 3 policemen as bodyguards. So, I was driving a standard shift car with an AK-47 on my lap and a handheld GPS trying to learn my way around Baghdad. And I didn't realize, being out that far out in advance, if you want, the tip of the spear, I didn't realize what was going on behind the scenes that much. Jay Garner, I didn't go into the green zone very often. I never met Jay Garner. When Paul Bremer came, we'd see him walk through the corridors with the phalanx of security guards inside the Republican Palace. He probably had 6 or 7 security guards inside. So when I saw the film over at MIT at one of the early screenings, it was very eye-opening to me to see what was going on back in Washington and that was affecting us. I can remember we were about to make the chief of police in Baghdad, and we found out that the Ba'ath Party policy was coming down, and he wasn't going to be allowed to be the chief of police. So we had to regroup and go through the whole selection process all over again. And now I understand a little more about how some of those decisions were made or weren't made.
And Charles, I wonder, one of the things I said in the introduction was how sort of you, in a way, stood in for the rest of us who would have liked to ask those questions of those people and who've wanted to understand for so long how something could go so badly wrong, what everyone thought of the initial invasion. I wonder, there's a fair amount of restraint that you seem to exhibit in the interviews. I mean, apart from the occasional, huh? Or really? As I've been teasing you about. But you seem to hold back and do what I think is a remarkable job sort of letting your subjects tell the story for themselves. I wonder if you could tell us, amid all these interviews, and there's so many interviews you've done that don't end up on the screen, but what the angriest period was for you, or what the angriest moment was for you. If you had a moment where you're in the analytic guts of it, trying to sort it out, and it's a big puzzle, and then where you just snap out of it and just say, ugh, and be tempted to sort of throw your microphone down and I don't know, defect.
Well, there were a number. Obviously, there are many things about this situation that are tremendously emotional and that make one tremendously emotional. Many of the experiences that I had in Iraq were, of course, like that. I found much of it quite astonishing. By the time I started making the film, which was in mid-2005, I already had some sense that a number of very serious mistakes had been made in the way the war and occupation had been handled. And I'd spoken at some length to George Packer and other journalists who had covered it, and I know some people in the military, and I'd spoken with them. One of them, who I can't name, quite senior person in the military, who was really very angry about many things that occurred. But I have to say, given all that, I was still utterly astonished when people would tell me the things they told me. Not having telephones, not having internet access for months after the start of the occupation. The fact that General Sanchez and L. Paul Bremer detested each other personally and went a year almost without speaking. The senior military commander, the senior civilian, not communicating because they hated each other. Many other things. It's difficult to choose. I have to say, perhaps the time when I became most personally engaged in the process of doing the interviews was the second interview I did with Walt Slocum. The second time I interviewed Walter Slocum, I had already found out an enormous amount about what happened between April 23rd and May 9. And it's a period that the Bush administration is not going to be eager to have excavated. And I think that when that classified material and those records finally become available, I think we're going to find that it's even more astonishing than we already know. And it was very clear to me that neither Mr. Slocum nor other people were interested in my learning the chronology of those events and who actually spoke with whom and who didn't speak with whom, when decisions were taken, who was present in the room and who was not present in the room when decisions were taken. And Mr. Slocum was, he was an odd combination of riddled with guilt and shame, extraordinarily defensive, and very evasive. And when the full transcript of the interview is published, which it will be in a few months, I think that will be evident.
Well, you certainly gave us a good snapshot of those qualities in the film. I mean, the exchanges between him and Hughes, of course, and that juxtaposition you do is one of the most memorable parts of the film. Could you update the audience now? I mean, I think probably in part because of the popularity of the film, this issue of who issued the order to do demobilization of the Army. And I don't know if you would claim credit for that, but it certainly seems like you've put that question back out before readers and viewers, and so it's back in the news as to how did it happen. Bremer has come out and claimed that the Army was already demobilized and that it was the president. It was very much in on that conversation. And you were telling me earlier that you were going to respond to Bremer's claim. I mean, what is the truth, as you understand it, about the president's involvement and Bremer's defense, which he's just issued in 2 weeks ago, I think?
The picture that emerges of President Bush's behavior during this period is of a man who was extraordinarily disengaged and every now and then inserted himself into some decision or some question, usually in a quite peculiar, idiosyncratic way. But with regard to the core decisions that were made, was extraordinarily passive. And that seems to have been the case with regard to disbanding the Army. Bremer and Rumsfeld informed President Bush of the fact that the Army was going to be disbanded the day before the official announcement on May 23rd. There is no evidence whatsoever that President Bush or the National Security Council was aware that this was being done until that time. And there's considerable evidence that they didn't. And there's also considerable evidence that, in fact, the decision had actually been made on May 9. It was on May 9, for example, that General Paul Eaton, who's very briefly in the film, General Paul Eaton was in charge of training the new Iraqi army. And he was at an army base outside of Seattle when his cell phone rang, and someone from the Pentagon told him that his new job was going to be training a new Iraqi army because the Iraqi army was going to be disbanded. And he got that phone call on May 9. He did not get that phone call on May 23rd. He got that phone call on May 9. So in response to Ambassador Bremer's op-ed article in the New York Times, sometime this evening, the New York Times is going to post a 10-minute long video that we've spent the last 6 days constructing about what really happened with regard to the disbanding of the Army and what its consequences were. And it's, to put it mildly, not what Ambassador Bremer says.
Interesting. Could you talk about the consequences, Jared, briefly? And I'd love to encourage students now. We're just going to open it up for questions, and there are microphones here, there, and then up there and up there. So just come up to the mic. It's getting late. I want to make sure we get to hear from you. But as people assemble, Jerry, would you talk about the tangible consequence as you lived it of these decisions? I mean, you alluded to the rotating police chiefs and so forth. And was it de-Baathification and or demobilization that you most dealt with the consequences
Well, the demobilization of the Army, the argument has been that the Army sort of disbanded itself and everybody went home. Well, the same thing happened to the police. In fact, as the American military was moving forward, they were giving out instructions to the Iraqi security forces, Army and police, lay down your weapons, take off your uniforms, and go home, and don't resist. Well, the police did that. They all abandoned their police stations, which eventually were all looted. I mean, right down to the wire taken out of the walls. I mean, they were stripped bare. And the police did that, but so did the Army. Well, when we recalled the police, they came back to work. About probably 60% of them eventually returned to work. I think the same number probably would have returned, especially your lower enlisted men that would have made up the bulk. The generals, yes, some of them would have been complicit in the regime. They probably would not have come back, but some of your basic soldiers, your non-coms, and maybe your junior officer corps would probably have returned to work, and we would have had a lot more security forces to quell some of the violence that obviously came after.
Interesting. All right, when you ask a question, do ask a question. That would be requirement number one. And two, introduce yourself before you do. Thank you.
Great. First, thank you to Mr. Ferguson, Mr. Boyd.
Introduce yourself if you could.
Right. I'm, well, that's going to be a little bit longer of an introduction. Truth in Advertising, and Charles and I obviously know each other from previous life. I'm Lieutenant Colonel John Tan. I served in Tal Afar and Ramadi, Iraq, from January 2006 to February 2007, and also in, thank you, thanks. Also in 2004 and in Desert Storm, 20-year Army career officer. And I should point out there's several other Iraqi Army and Marine and probably some Navy and Air Force veterans in here as well. In fact, I see one standing over there about to ask a question. First thing is I want to thank you, Charles, for coming here tonight and screening the film with us. It was very interesting to watch, and like Mr. Boyd, interesting to me, some of the background that was going on. And even though I'm a lieutenant colonel and a battalion commander, obviously not privy to what's happening at the highest echelons within Iraq or the government. A comment, and then sort of segueing off of that, a question. First, I want to thank you for giving voice to Specialist Gonzalez, Specialist Yancey, and Lieutenant Moulton. Those are important voices to be heard. I have several soldiers and young officers just like that, and to include 5 who perished in my unit in '89 within my brigade. I'm most taken by his comment, Lieutenant Moulton's comment at the very end, which he says, is this the best America can do? I personally believe it is not. And I agree with you, it's about 3/4 of the way through the film, where you say that President Bush, but mostly those within the State Department and the military are trying to rectify, honestly, 3 very bad decisions, and I concur with that as a private citizen, that were made by who? I don't know, possibly L. Paul Bremer, but nonetheless, they were mistakes. We are clearly trying to recover from that within the military, within the U.S. government, within the coalition, on all 3. Training of the Iraqi security force, the Iraqi army, the Iraqi police, reconstruction, and putting a more sovereign government, there's obviously one there now, back into place. Do you think, and can we and should we continue in Iraq along that path, especially if some of those objectives can be met? And again, thank you for coming tonight. I really appreciate it, Charles.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Samantha Power and I spoke for half an hour, 45 minutes before the film started about, in large measure, about the question of what the United States can and should do now in Iraq. And it's, I think that everybody who deals with this question feels some version of the same sentiment, which is all the options are bad. And it's an incredibly horrific situation. I certainly feel, and I think many of us feel, most of us feel, that the United States has an enormous moral obligation to try and do whatever it can to correct the damage that its mistakes has brought. It's not clear, however, how much the United States can do. Nir Rosen, a journalist who appears briefly in the film, with whose views I don't always agree, but he's very, very perceptive, intelligent man, he said to me recently, and it's absolutely right, the American military is now just another militia in Iraq. And it's very unclear how much political leverage we have, how much military leverage we have, and it's also very unclear what the effects would be if we started to withdraw. Many people, the majority with whom I spoke, think that there will be a lot of violence and possibly really horrific violence when the United States starts to withdraw. I don't know that I have any magic bullets to provide. I really don't. I think that it's worth trying to engage all of the regional powers and all of the now domestic military powers in Iraq, the militias, the warlords, in whatever discussion we can, and I don't think that that's being done yet in as serious and complete a way as one might. What could and would come of that is not clear. Not clear to me, certainly. I don't think it's clear to anybody. I've spoken with very intelligent people recently who think that the United States should support a military coup in Iraq. I've spoken with intelligent people who think that the United States should issue an ultimatum and threaten to withdraw quickly and abruptly unless the domestic parties can come to an agreement. And others, George Packer, for example, feel that we have an obligation to stay. I honestly don't know. We should try things, and if they don't work, be prepared to change course quickly. Do you want to say anything?
Well, I just add that there's been a sort of polarity to the debates. One of the things we were talking about between those who say if we stay, we can turn it around and act as if that leverage, political and military leverage, does exist. And then those who want to leave, yesterday probably didn't want to go in the first place, who say if we leave, actually the consequences will be fine. We, the United States, are the source of so much of the trouble there and so much of the violence. And there's been very little political debate in between. And I think that's really unfortunate, and very little emphasis on what a civilian protection or an Iraqi-centered debate about Iraq would look like. I mean, just as that's the flaw that Charles's film unearths, that the Iraqis are never part of these conversations, and what would be good or bad for Iraqi welfare is not even a consideration. So too, I think that's marring our debate about withdrawal. It's, if we withdraw, everything will be fine, it'll get better for Iraqis, well, probably unlikely in the short term, versus staying, we're gonna make it better. I mean, there's gotta be some way of actually talking constructively about how to get out as responsibly as possible in accordance with that moral obligation that you incur when you invade a country and destroy, stabilizing, if, not terribly pleasant institutions. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. I'm Devin Bean, and I'm a freshman here at Harvard College. And thank you very much for a very pertinent present viewpoint here on the war in Iraq. My question then would be, how do you see this war now and the decisions that led up to it, the decisions going into it now, and definitely the ones following? How do you see those decisions and the way that this war is being conducted in relation to previous wars, where we have things, things like the occupation of Japan afterwards, where Douglas MacArthur and what he set up, or even looking at instances such as the Bay of Pigs and the troop numbers there? How does Iraq compare to other instances of U.S. military involvement?
Well, Samantha Power knows an awful lot about this and wrote a very long book in large measure about that question, or in significant measure about that question. The parallels with Vietnam grow greater and more eerie with every passing day. There are some differences, though, and one difference that's quite salient is that the consequences of withdrawing from Vietnam were relatively contained, and it's not clear that the consequences of withdrawing from Iraq would be relatively contained. There's much more at stake in the Mideast with regard to the possibility of a regional nuclear arms race, possible warfare between the Iranians and the Saudis, the level of violence that there could be domestically in the country, energy markets, the Palestinian problem. The stakes are very high here. I don't know much more than, I don't know that I can say much more than that. I don't think that I have much to say about the occupation question, except that yes, the occupations following World War II they weren't always done perfectly by any means, but they were certainly given much more thought than this one was.
And just a footnote on the Japanese occupation. I mean, there was a full-on occupation of the country, and part of what Charles shows so well is that it's one thing to disband or demobilize the army, but it's another thing to demobilize the army, de-Ba'athify, and thereby decapitate governing institutions. It's another thing to do those two things and not have sufficient troops yourself to fill the security void. So, conceivably, you could have done those two things somehow. I mean, it wouldn't have been advisable under the best of circumstances, but you certainly had an obligation to look out for who was going to supply security within the country. And so, MacArthur, for all of his, flaws and later in life and whatever leadership he exercised there was at least a commensurate relationship between his political ambition and his military presence in the country.
That's actually, that's a point worth emphasizing. There were many comparisons made inside the Bush administration between denazification in post-World War II Germany and de-Baathification in post-war Iraq. The occupation of Germany, however, involved 1.5 million American troops.
And they had a plan. George Marshall started working on the plan in 1942 for an occupation that occurred in 45. And I think we're still working on the plan for Iraq 5 years after the fact.
That's a very good point. Okay, up at the top, yes.
Good evening. My name is Nick Taranto. I'm a first-year Master's in Public Policy candidate. I was in New York on 9/11, and after watching your film, the sentiment that I feel most closely expresses what I was feeling that day is just anger, extreme anger, and just a desire to do something. So I'm at the Kennedy School. Obviously, I'm an idealist of some sort. What do you recommend that someone in his or her mid-20s do at this point in history? I still feel the U.S. has a huge role in the world to play. What do we do? I mean, it's a huge question, I know, but...
I don't think that I can give you life guidance. With whatever disposable income and energy you might have, there are a number of organizations that are working to ameliorate the condition of Iraqi refugees and refugees from other countries, and who work to prevent or minimize the damage from conflicts, ethnic, political, military conflicts, and I encourage you to become involved with them.
Thank you.
Could you say a word about your, your decision to do what you did with this film? Because in a sense, you were, again, him asking that question, reading George Packer's articles in the New Yorker, and then you decided to use the resources you had to make this film. I mean, what was that process like for you? You met your friends, did they think you were sane?
My friends of long standing are used to my bouts of insanity. I have found several times now, I've gone off the deep end a couple of times, and I've found several times that doing something interesting and hopefully useful involves a very bizarre mixture of paranoia and insecurity on one hand and arrogance on the other. And that was very true with regard to making this film. And on the one hand, you know, who the hell am I to decide that I'm going to make a film about the American project in Iraq and its consequences? But on the other hand, first of all, nobody else was doing it. And the first time that I had this idea, which was in 2004, after a dinner with George Packer, who I've known for a long time. I've known George for 15 years. We used to play poker together. He won. I went to a number of friends of mine in the media and in the film industry and suggested this, and they all said, don't do it for two reasons. One is a very difficult first film to make. The issues involved in filming in Iraq and many other things, hard to do. True. And the other thing they said was 10 other people are going to be making this film. And I waited for a year and nobody else was making this film. And so I said, what the fuck? Excuse me. I know this is a family audience, I'm sorry.
But that was the career guidance. If you were looking for career guidance, I think you got it. Yeah.
My name is Trevor Baker, and I'm a sophomore at the college. So much of your film focused on mistakes that were made by civilian leaders, bad decisions that were made essentially, that were made without consultation with the military, or where other civilians were, leadership were essentially shunted aside, and people were elevated within the inner circles of the Bush administration. And it struck me as sort of a perversion of what we think about civilian control of the military, essentially that it's a feature that's unique in the United States. Not only to the United States, but just in that we don't rely on military leaders to make decisions on when to go to war and on exactly what to do. But your film showed the consequences of that. And I'm curious as to whether you think that this is just a flaw we have to permit within our system, our democratic system, that elected leaders like within the Bush administration can simply boost up their own political allies and they leave us with these consequences, or whether you believe the military and generals within it or retired generals should have done more to try to dissuade the U.S. from going to war or to change what the Bush administration's policies were.
Very interesting, very deep question. I think, I don't know if this is possible, but if there were a way, legally and institutionally, to completely preserve civilian control over the military, in the sense that when the president tells the military what to do, the military obeys, period. Well, the president advised by Congress. And yet at the same time, make it easier for members of the military, particularly senior members of the military, to speak out without fear of career consequences if they feel that there is something that they need to say. That would be a good thing. There is a law, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which gives the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, by law, direct access to the president. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not exercise their right in this case, despite the fact that it is by now fairly well known that members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and many members of their staff and many senior people in the military were very disturbed about the haste with which war was being prepared and the decisions made about troop levels. And we saw what happened when General Shinseki spoke up. 1 week later, Secretary Rumsfeld announced his replacement, announced the name of his replacement, even though General Shinseki had another 18 months, I believe, in his term. And he was quite rapidly marginalized, and he was privately dressed down by both Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz. So would it have made a difference? I don't know. But for whatever it's worth, I offer that comment.
Alana.
Hi, my name is Alana. I'm a dual degree student here at the Kennedy School and at the Business School. And actually, we read a case about Mr. Ferguson at the Business School about his previous endeavors in the business world. And so when we realized as you sat down, those of us who were here from the Business School were like, wait a second, we already saw him on a big Jumbotron during our school year last year talking about your business career. And I was just wondering if you could speak to what the learning curve was like in this transition. And it seemed like you had sort of really amazing access to important thinkers, important decision makers. So I was curious about the learning curve piece, the access piece, and then finally, kind of what are you going to do now? Do you think you want to continue on as an advocate or as a filmmaker, or what next?
There were some very interesting and useful similarities between starting the company that I started now 13 years ago, and making this film, and those were helpful. What was helpful about it was two things. First of all, starting a company and making a film are similar structurally. When you make a film, you essentially start a single-purpose company for the purpose of making the film, and then you disband it when the film is done. And you have to do that quite quickly. The entire cycle for making the film was 18 months, and so, you know, with some dispatch, you have to hire people, assemble a team, create a budget, get things done. And my experience starting the software company was very useful in that regard because it was kind of triple distilled. When I started Vermeer Technologies, which developed a software tool for developing websites in 1994, when I started that company, the World Wide Web was growing 20% per month, which is fast. And keeping up was hard. And so actually, you know, to my amusement, I found, you know, people in the film industry would tell me that, you know, this is a hard first film to make. Making this film, you know, frankly, was very easy relative to running Vermeer Technologies Incorporated. And, you know, having negotiating with for acquisition and simultaneously competing with Netscape, Microsoft, and America Online. Making this movie was easy. That's actually a serious comment. I guess the other thing that I would say is that my academic background, I think, did indirectly but substantially help me with regard to the access problem. I will never know why Richard Armitage agreed to be interviewed, but Richard Armitage has not frequently agreed to be interviewed, and I think that the interview that I conducted with him is still the only long interview that he has conducted with anyone about Iraq. And I was not gentle in my questions. Not all of them are evident here, but I asked him why he didn't resign. I asked him why he didn't talk to the president. I was not. It was not a softball interview. And there were a couple of times he was evasive, but mostly he was very direct. I think maybe part of the reason that he spoke with me was that he recognized that I wasn't Michael Moore and that I was trying to make a different kind of film. I hope so. Don't know.
And who are you now?
Now, well, first of all, we're doing, it is a collective endeavor. We are doing a book based on all of the interview transcripts. What you see in the film is only about 1% of the interviews we conducted. We conducted about 60 or 70 long interviews in the United States and another, 30 or 40 in Iraq. We have somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 pages of interview transcripts, and much of that material is very interesting. And so the book is going to have, be about 300 pages long, and about 2/3 of it is going to be just people speaking in the interviews. And simultaneously, we hope, we're still negotiating about this, but we hope that simultaneously with the publication of the book, we'll be able to put up on a website the full transcripts of all of the interviews, which I think will be useful for a lot of people.
Yeah. Sorry, here, yes.
Hi, my name is Kent Park. I'm an MPP student here. I'm also a U.S. Army officer and fairly recently returned from Iraq from 2005 to 2006, where I was a company commander. I first wanted to comment on something that you said. It wasn't directly from you. You were quoting someone about the U.S. military almost being seen as another militia in Iraq. And I would strongly disagree with that, just from my experience. We are probably, U.S. Army is probably one of the few honest brokers in Iraq, and we serve an incredible service in terms of being a mediator between the different factions. And just based on my experience of 16 months being there and talking to the people, that if it weren't for the U.S. Army or U.S. military, U.S. military providing that legitimacy to the Iraqi security forces, Iraq will rapidly go into further chaos, and it's going to make current problems that we're having in Iraq look relatively stable compared to what I think it will turn out to be. And my question would be, and it kind of adds on to the previous question about civilian leaders listening to military advice, military leaders' advice. And I think there's a lot of evidence that it was not heeded, military advice was not heeded going into Iraq. In terms of coming out, has this issue been so politicized that the military leaders' advice will not be heeded by current or future leaders, whoever may take office next? Are they going to listen to the military advice in terms of timing and how we should pull out of Iraq, or is it going to be done based on political needs?
Well, first of all, I owe you an apology. You're absolutely right in the comment that you made about the role of the American military. The sense, however, in which I think the comment that I quoted is true, and this was the point that I was trying to make, and I apologize I made it badly, and perhaps failed to make it, is that the level of power that the American military has in Iraq is now, only roughly comparable with the level of power that, say, the Kurdish have, or that the Mahdi Army has, or that the Badr Brigade has. In some ways, its power is greater. It has many more weapons of greater sophistication, but in some ways its power is less. Everybody in the Mahdi army knows what Iraq is like and speaks Arabic, and that's not true of American military personnel. With regard to your question, I guess I'm very pessimistic about the ability of this administration to listen honestly to anybody, not just the military. It's not just the military's advice that's been disregarded, it's the advice of the intelligence community, it's the advice of Mideast experts, it's the advice of the State Department. And ironically, during the time that the planning, such as it was, for the war was being conducted, the three most experienced people with regard to, at senior levels in the government, with regard to occupations, counterinsurgencies, relevant military experience, were Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, who was also a career military officer, and Lawrence Wilkerson, who was a career Army officer, an Army colonel, who had been through Vietnam. And I don't think that the last 4 years can make anyone optimistic about this administration's ability to listen. The next administration, let's hope.
Yes, ma'am?
Yes, hi, my name is Palak Shah. I'm an MPP1 student here at the Kennedy School of Government. My question is, to the extent that you believe history affects the future and that the future or the public or collective consciousness is shaped by what happens today, what is the conclusion that you would like, each of you, what is the conclusion that you would like the viewer and the American public at large to draw? I mean, the film seems to depict the story, kind of a story of the incompetent imperialist, or is it your intention to advocate for a more competent occupation, or is there some larger question that you're trying to raise by this public debate?
You first.
They hear enough from me. They've heard enough from me tonight and round the clock for the rest of their lives. I would only say that I think it underscores the importance of dissent and diverse viewpoints. It underscores the importance of checks and balances. We have a constitution written the way it's written for a reason, with 3 branches of government meant to check and balance one another. We have a executive branch divided the way it is into separate departments and so forth for a reason. We have a House and a Senate for a reason. I mean, the idea is to, the sort of Madisonian insight was that, it wouldn't be a recipe for paralysis so much as it would be for actually getting your game up. And for them to systematically exclude, this applies to any policy area and certainly applies to this school, one of the things we teach, is the importance of having diverse viewpoints in the room, if only to be able to anticipate and address concerns that people have. And so to me, it's a monument to something larger than a cataclysmic, catastrophic foreign policy failure. It's a monument to the consequences of hubris and believing that oneself or one's office can internalize alternative viewpoints, which is what, in Guantanamo, it's the same thing. There's still a belief that we have the ability to extract all sides of a story. No, you have defense lawyers for that to help people, this adversarial and checks and balance notion that is, I think, the cornerstone of this democracy. You see the peril of throwing out the cornerstone.
I hope that we don't slip into a period of isolationism. I hope that we find better ways to project our values and our interests overseas than with the military. I think you go in many embassies around the world and you find that military officers frequently outnumber foreign service officers in these embassies. I think the State Department has got to stand up to its responsibilities and not be so timid and vapid as it has been over the last 4 or 5 years. And I also, as Giles was saying, I would encourage all of you, if not now, at some point in your life, take a mission overseas. Work for an NGO. When you get the financial ability to do it, there's hundreds of NGOs out there. You don't have to go to Iraq. There's Africa, there's Latin America, there's Asia, there's other places to go and see what it is like overseas.
But I'm sorry, sir, is your assessment that we should have a more competent occupation, or is your assessment that there's something else should have, is there some larger question that you are grappling with?
Probably a larger question. I think that Our foreign policy is being controlled too much by the Department of Defense and not by the State Department, who should be controlling it.
At the risk of alienating the questioner and perhaps the audience, I would like to say that I personally don't think that it's entirely clear that using military force to remove Saddam Hussein was an inherently bad idea. He was not a nice man. And he had tried to develop nuclear weapons and had come reasonably close to developing them, actually. And I don't think that the world would have been a better place if he had come to have them. And if Iraq had continued on, it would have been subjected to very severe economic sanctions. Perhaps his sons would have come to power, one of whom was even more brutal than he, the other of whom was clinically psychotic. It's a very, very difficult, painful question, and my personal view is that reasonable people can disagree about whether it was, on balance, moral, useful, possible to use military force to depose Saddam. But I think that it is very important to understand that there's a difference between going to war arrogantly and incompetently and insensitively as opposed to intelligently. And I think that that's true also of America's behavior in Vietnam. Whether or not it was a good idea to intervene in Vietnam, it mattered a great deal that the United States defoliated 20% of that country and dropped enough bombs to kill over 1 million people. And in making this film, I hope that it will have some effect on how people think about the next time America uses military force, and America will use military force again.
Hi, my name is Joanna Naples-Mitchell. I'm a sophomore at the college. My question is in regard to another form of kind of not listening on the part of the military, and especially U.S. civilian officials, because you've talked a lot about how U.S. officials basically just ignored what a lot of people in the military were saying about Iraq and how to properly manage the reconstruction. And I'm wondering about the contrast that you made between the UN compound that was open to the concerns of Iraqis and the U.S. officials in the Green Zone basically holding themselves in there and not willing to listen to concerns. So my question is, how do you think that in the short term, within the next 10 years, the United States can reshape its military policy and its attitude towards civilians, so at least when we still have modern warfare, which doesn't seem to be going anywhere, we can at least have an attitude towards civilians that's willing to listen and basically admit mistakes?
I think that there's a lot of evidence that the military is in fact learning from this experience, very harsh, painful experience. You can perhaps speak to the counterinsurgency manual. I think that you spoke about that earlier when we were talking. A lot of this, however, was about senior politicians and civilians not listening. And that might be harder, I don't know.
All right, I think the military is trying to make the civilian the epicenter. It used to be that the terrorist was or the insurgent was the epicenter of military planning. Now the civilian is meant to be at the center of it. The counterinsurgency manual was co-authored by David Petraeus, who's now in Iraq trying to apply this doctrine. He claims the gap between doctrine and reality in the world is very great. But the one thing I would just add is that the military, after every engagement, and guys tell me if I'm wrong, but guys and I'm sure women here, there's rapid after-action reports that are done in the wake of engagements for that kind of learning to try to take place, and that some of that after-action reporting has then been integrated into this counterinsurgency manual, into the new doctrine. There's no civilian after-action reporting. Charles has done it. This is the after-action report on what the Bush administration did in Iraq. I mean, had there been, even in those early days and weeks, I mean, those 3 decisions that Charles documents, over-determine probably the likelihood of failure, but the fact that there was no revisitation of faulty policies as they went throughout that entire summer of 2003 is just reprehensible. This is going to be the very last question, and keep the answer very brief because Charles has to run off. Yes, sir.
My name is Yasun Athanasiadis. I'm a Nieman Fellow, Nieman Journalism Fellow this year, and I spent the past 10 years covering the Middle East and most recently Iran for 3 years. The last part of your film was about consequences, and I wanted to ask you if possible to take it a little bit further down the line and tell us what do you think would be the consequences, having studied in depth the thinking of the Bush administration with regards to Iran, what might be the consequences, and what lessons can be learned from this misadventure in dealing with Iran?
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I don't know very much about Iran. And if, one thing that I hope this film communicates is that if you make big decisions based on not very much knowledge, bad things can happen. And of course I know something about Iran, having been involved with this issue, but I don't know that I'm qualified to comment. Would you like to say anything about this?
No, I mean, I think people are leaving, and they probably have residual questions they might want to ask just as Charles is walking out. So I think what we'll do is end it there, and perhaps we can talk later. But let us all just join in a final round of applause for Charles for this remarkable film. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Yunus, for sharing this very special day, but far more important, your very special message. Safe journeys to all of you. Thank you very much.
And Eid Mubarak to all of you. Thank you.